The blood on her scrubs wasn't hers. Listen, K-Fam. Leona Whitfield presses one gloved hand to a stranger's ribs and keeps him breathing. She's a Black emergency and post-trauma nurse, 29 years old, a widow for 1 year. She wears her dead husband's silence like a second uniform, and she never cries. Then they wheel him in, a man in cuffs, a police escort that sweats too much and stands too close to their own guns. Omo, the paperwork is wrong. The story is wrong. Leona cleans the wound on his neck and freezes. A koi carp, black ink, curling up behind his ear. His name is Jang Tae-song. They call him the Quiet One. Korean, 37, charcoal 3-piece suit, a steel watch, eyes you can't read. She understands, in one breath, that these men aren't here to save him. They're here to finish him. So she kills the lights on the ward. He comes back, not to collect, to thank her. Phone calls after the night shift, a quiet Japanese dinner, rides home in his car, and a letter on her table about a residual balance she doesn't understand yet. But what she doesn't know about the man in the charcoal suit, IU. That's where it gets dangerous. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. Leona Whitfield pressed both thumbs into the man's femoral artery and held pressure while the monitor above her screamed a number no body was supposed to survive. 62/40. Then 58. The bag of O-negative squeezed dry in Deborah's fist, and Leona did not lift her hands. She counted. She counted the way she always counted, in tens, because tens kept her steady when everything under her palms went slick and warm and wrong. "Come on," she said to the man, low, private, like a secret between the two of them. "Not tonight. You don't get tonight." The number climbed. 66/70. Somewhere behind her, a resident exhaled like he'd been underwater. The trauma bay stank of iron and burnt coffee, and the ammonia they mopped the floor with, and Leona stayed bent over the gurney another 40 seconds after the bleeding slowed, her scrubs soaked through at the wrists, blue cotton gone black. Then she straightened, snapped the gloves off inside out, dropped them in the red bin without looking. "That's 3 tonight," Deborah said. "That's 3. They both watched the transport team wheel him up toward surgery. Leona rolled her neck until it cracked. Her shift had ended 19 minutes ago. Nobody had told her body. The emergency department at 3 in the morning was a machine that never stopped chewing. Leona had learned to move inside it without wasting anything. No wasted steps. No wasted breath, no wasted feeling. She restocked a crash cart. She signed off a chart. She held the hand of a 90-year-old woman who kept asking for a husband 40 years in the ground, and Leona said he was on his way, he was parking the car, he'd be right in. You lie to the dying about the dead. That's the job nobody puts in the pamphlet. A drunk kid came in around 2 with a bottle cap gash over his eyebrow and cried harder about the 4 stitches than the man in Bay 3 had cried about losing a hand. Leona numbed him, sewed him, and told him he'd have a scar girls would ask about. He was 19 and alive and would forget her by Thursday. And that was fine. That was the whole point of the good ones. They walked out and forgot you. The ones you remembered were the ones who didn't walk out at all. She'd learned the difference her first year, and she'd learned to stop carrying either kind home. A nurse who carries every shift home doesn't last 5 years, and Leona was going on 8. She had a system. The system was simple. You gave a patient everything you had for as long as they were in front of you, and the second they rolled through the doors you set them down. You did not follow them up to surgery in your mind. You did not wonder. You picked up the next one. The system had one flaw, and she never let herself look at it directly. The system worked on strangers. It had never once worked on the two people she'd actually loved. Deborah caught her at the lockers when it was finally over. "You look like something the cat gave up on." "Thanks, Deb. I mean it. When did you last sleep a whole night?" Leona pulled her cardigan over the ruined scrubs, that charcoal gray one gone soft and shapeless from 100 washes. "I sleep fine." "You sleep like a woman keeping watch." Deborah's voice dropped, and the teasing went out of it. "It's been a year, baby. A year Tuesday. You gonna let anybody carry a corner of it? Or you planning to hold the whole thing yourself till it breaks your back?" Leona zipped the bag. She touched the small gold cross at her throat, quick, the way another woman touches a scar to check it's still healing. "I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna sleep. That's my whole plan." "That's not a plan. That's a sentence." Deborah looked at her a long second, the kind of look that had raised 4 kids and buried a mother, and knew exactly how much weight a person could hide behind a zipped bag and a flat voice. She didn't push. That was the mercy of Deborah. She'd say the true thing once, plant it, and let it grow on your schedule instead of hers. "Good night, Deb." She walked to the parking garage under lights that buzzed like something dying, and she did not think about Tuesday. She had a gift for that. You could hand Leona Whitfield a grief and she would file it, label it, close the drawer, and go save a stranger's life with steady hands. Everybody at St. Ambrose said she was the calmest nurse on the floor. What they meant was, they had never once seen her flinch, and they mistook that for peace. The drive home was 20 minutes of empty highway. She kept the radio off. Manned? The house sat at the end of a short street, where the street lamps thinned out, a one-story, with white siding, and a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. There had been 2 chairs. Now there was one, and a square of paint less faded where the other used to sit. Leona parked in the driveway, and killed the engine, and sat there a moment in the dark, with her hands at 10 and 2, like the car was still moving. She and Marcus had bought this house 4 years ago. She remembered the walk-through, the realtor talking about crown molding, while Marcus stood in the empty kitchen with his arms crossed doing math in his head. The good kind of math, the kind about a future. 30-year mortgage. He'd signed his name under hers with a pen that skipped, and he'd laughed, and he'd said, "This pen doesn't want us to have a house," and she'd said, "Too bad, the pen doesn't get a vote." The pen. She hadn't thought about the pen in months. Funny what waited for you in a dark driveway. She went in through the side door, towed her shoes off in the mudroom. The house held that specific silence a house holds when only one person lives in it. Not empty, exactly, but listening, the way a room listens after a question nobody answered. On the kitchen counter, the mail. She'd let it stack for 3 days. She always let it stack. Bills came electronic now, so the paper was mostly noise, coupons and campaign flyers, and the occasional card from a church member who still wrote by hand. She sorted it standing up, still in her cardigan, one thumb flicking envelopes into 2 piles, trash and not trash, moving fast, half asleep on her feet. Then her thumb stopped. The envelope was heavy, good stock. A window on the front, and behind the window her own name in a typeface that meant lawyers, or money, or both. The return address was the mortgage servicer, not the friendly logo, the friendly logo she knew. This was a different name underneath it, smaller, a name she didn't recognize, followed by 3 letters, LLC. She stood very still. Then she did what she did in the trauma bay. She stopped feeling and started reading. She slid a finger under the flap and tore it clean, and unfolded the single page, and her eyes went down the lines, the way they went down a lab panel, hunting the one number that mattered. And there it was, boxed, bolded, near the bottom. Residual balance due. She read the figure, she read it again, She turned the paper toward the light over the stove as if the light might change it. The words around the number were smooth and terrible in the way official words are terrible. They were sorry to inform, they wished to advise, they were writing to notify her that a review of the account had identified an outstanding residual balance associated with the property, and that failure to resolve this balance within the stated period could result in, and then a sentence she read 4 times, because the first 3 times her brain refused to let it land, could result in initiation of proceedings against the property. The property, her house, Marcus's kitchen, the square of faded paint where the second chair used to sit. Leona set the letter flat on the counter and pressed both palms down on either side of it, the way she'd pressed down on that man's leg an hour ago. Hold pressure, count in tens. The mortgage was paid. She knew it was paid. When Marcus died, there had been a policy, a small mercy, and it had cleared the balance in one cold transaction, while she was still learning how to sign her own name on forms with the word deceased in them. She had watched the account go to 0. She had a letter that said 0. She had kept that letter. She kept everything. So this was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. Some algorithm hiccuping in an office she would never see. Some clerk who mistyped a number. Some file that got merged with a stranger's. Things like this happened. They happened, and you called a number in the morning, and a tired voice apologized, and it went away. She told herself all of that, standing at the counter at 4 in the morning, and her hands stayed flat and steady on the granite, and it should have worked. It always worked. It didn't work. Because underneath the reasonable part of her, the part that filed grief in drawers, and lied to the dying, and held pressure through the screaming monitor, something older had already woken up and started pacing. Something that had learned, 1 year ago on a Tuesday, that the floor can leave you with no warning at all, that the phone can ring in the afternoon, that a man can go to work with coffee breath and a joke about a pen and simply never turn the car back into the driveway. She thought about calling Deborah. Deborah would be home by now, feet up, some cooking show on low. Deborah would say, "Girl, don't you spend 1 second of your sleep on a form letter. You call them at 9 and you go to bed." And Deborah would be right, the way Deborah was usually right. And Leona still wouldn't sleep, because it wasn't the number that had its hook in her. It was the pattern of it, the way the worst things in her life had all arrived exactly like this. Quiet, official, on an ordinary surface. A phone that rang on a Tuesday. A second pink line that meant everything and then meant nothing. A letter on a kitchen counter at 4 in the morning. Disaster never kicked the door in. It slid under it, polite, on good stationery. She put the phone back down. She wasn't going to wake Deborah to be told she was overreacting. She already knew she was overreacting. Knowing didn't move the weight an inch. She folded the letter. She unfolded it. She folded it again along the same crease until the crease went white. Then she put it in the drawer with the takeout menus, shut the drawer, and stood there, with her hand still on the handle, breathing. "In the morning," she said out loud, to nobody. "I'll call in the morning." The house listened and did not answer. She should have gone to bed. Her body was a wrung-out thing, begging to lie down. Instead, she found herself walking down the short hall, past the bathroom, past the room she called the office because she could not yet call it anything else, to the bedroom at the end. She flipped the light. She didn't undress. The closet was on the left. His side was still his side. She had given away exactly one thing in a year, a coat, to a man at the shelter who was the same size Marcus had been, because it seemed obscene to let a warm coat hang in the dark while a man froze, and the guilt of that one coat had cured her of touching anything else. The shirts still hung in their order. The shoes still stood in their pairs. She could still, on the bad nights, press her face into a sleeve and find something underneath the cedar and the dust that was almost him. She was not going to do that tonight, she had told herself. She had a whole plan, and the plan was sleep. She knelt anyway. At the back of the closet, behind his shoes, there was a box. Not a fancy box. A plastic tub with a blue lid, the kind you buy in a pack of 3, and on the lid in her own handwriting, in marker gone faint, one word. She'd written it herself, months ago, on a night she didn't remember well. She pulled it out across the carpet. It was lighter than grief should be. She sat back on her heels on the closet floor, in her cardigan, in the ruined blue scrubs, and she took off the lid. On top, a blanket, yellow, the softest yellow, small enough to fold into 2 hands. It had never warmed anything. They'd bought it the week the second line went pink, the week they let themselves believe, and they had been so far ahead of themselves, so stupid and so happy and so far ahead, that they'd bought the blanket before they'd bought anything sensible, before the crib, before the appointment, because Marcus had held it up in the store and said, "Feel this, feel how soft, our kid is gonna live in this thing." Their kid did not get to live in anything. 10 weeks. That was as far as they got the first time. The second time, further and worse. There had not been a third time, because there had not been more time at all. The last one was still a plan, a someday, a conversation they kept having in the dark with their voices low and hopeful, when the phone rang on a Tuesday and there was no more someday to plan inside of. Under the blanket, the shoes, if you could call them shoes, 2 knitted things the length of her thumb, white with a yellow ribbon, from Marcus's mother, who had knitted them before either loss, and had not had the heart to ask for them back, and Leona had not had the heart to return them. So they lived in the box. Everything that had no place to live lived in the box. Leona held the blanket in one hand and the small knitted shoes in the other, and she waited. She turned the little shoes over in her fingers. Marcus's mother had knitted the yellow ribbon in loose, so it could be tightened once there was an ankle to tighten it around. There had never been an ankle. The ribbon still hung loose, waiting, the way the whole house still hung loose and waiting, tuned to a future that had been cancelled without anybody sending a letter about it. Everything in her life came with a letter, except the losses that actually mattered. Those just happened, and left you holding the yellow thing, and expected you to know what to do next. This was the part where a woman cried. She knew that. She had watched 1,000 women cry in 1,000 worst nights of their lives. She knew the mechanics of it better than anyone. The catch in the breath, the way the face comes apart, the sound. She knew that if she were her own patient, she would sit down beside herself and take her hand and say, "It's all right. Let it come. You've earned every tear in the building." Nothing came. She sat on the floor of her dead husband's closet, holding the blanket for a baby that was never born and the shoes for feet that never took a step. On the anniversary week of the day her whole life turned into a box with a blue lid, and her eyes stayed dry as the desert. Dry as the day of the funeral, when the pastor had said her husband's name, and 40 people had wept, and Leona had stood at the front in her black dress, and felt nothing move behind her face at all. They'd said she was strong. At the funeral, at the hospital, everywhere. Leona Whitfield, so strong. She had let them say it, because the alternative was explaining, and she could not explain a thing she didn't understand herself, that the tears were in there. She could feel them, a whole ocean of them, pressing behind a door she had shut a year ago and could no longer find the handle to. She had locked something to survive, and now the lock had swallowed the key, and she did not know how to open the one door she needed open. So she did the only thing she knew how to do, with a feeling she couldn't reach. She lifted the small gold cross off her chest with 2 fingers, and she pressed it to her lips, hard enough to leave a mark, and she prayed the way she'd prayed every night for a year. Not for tears, she'd stopped asking for those, but for the thing underneath the tears. Lord, I know you're there. I know it. I just can't feel my hands on the wall anymore. Show me the wall. Put my hands on the wall. The house did not answer. God did not answer. Or answered in the way he usually did. In silence, you had to be strong enough to sit inside. She put the blanket back. She put the shoes back. She squared the corners so everything lay flat, because flat was better, flat was manageable, and she fit the blue lid down over the top until it clicked at all four corners. Then she slid the box to the back of the closet, behind his shoes, where it lived. She stood. Her knees ached from the floor. Outside, the black was going gray at the edges, the first thin light coming up over the neighbor's fence, and a bird she couldn't name started up in the dark like it had somewhere to be. Leona looked at the letter's ghost, still there in her mind even though the paper was 3 rooms away in a drawer full of takeout menus. Proceedings against the property. She thought about the number. She thought about the number. She thought about the number. And the letter that said 0, folded safe in the file box where she kept everything. A mistake. In the morning she would call, and it would be a mistake. And a tired voice would apologize. She almost believed it. She was very good at almost believing things. She undressed at last, dropped the ruined scrubs in the wash, and lay down on her half of a bed that had not been divided into halves for a year, and still was, the far side untouched, the pillow squared. She set her phone alarm for 4 hours. She closed her eyes. And in the last minute before sleep took her, the minute where the guard finally comes down because the body just won't hold it up anymore, one thought surfaced and would not sink again. Not grief, not the baby, not Marcus. The letter. That second name under the servicers, the small one she didn't recognize, the 3 letters after it, LLC. Why would a mistake come from a company she'd never heard of? She was asleep before the question could grow teeth. But the question was patient. It had all the time in the world, and somewhere across the city, in an office she would never see, so did the man who'd sent it. The gurney came through the ambulance doors backward, and that was the first thing wrong. Leona caught it in the corner of her eye between one chart and the next. Paramedics pull a gurney. These men pushed it, 3 of them, fast, heads down, like they were shoving a cart through a crowd they didn't want to be seen in. No radio call ahead. No handoff shouted across the bay. Just the doors banging open at 1:40 in the morning and a body strapped down under a gray blanket that somebody had pulled up too high, almost to the chin. "Where's my report?" Marcy called from triage. Nobody answered her. Leona set the chart down. 8 years on this floor taught her to read a room the way other people read a clock. One glance, done. And this room had just gone wrong in a way she felt in her teeth before her brain caught up. The man on the gurney had a wrist cuffed to the rail, not a soft restraint. Not the padded Velcro they used for the confused ones, the old men who swung at ghosts. Steel, a real handcuff, and above it a second strap across the chest, and the 3 men around him wearing windbreakers that said police across the back, in letters that sat a half-inch too high, too crooked, like somebody had ironed them on in a hurry. "Gunshot," the tallest one said. He had a flat voice and eyes that moved before his head did. Through and through, left side. "He's a transfer. We need a room. Private one." Leona looked at the blood, soaking the blanket at the man's hip. Then she looked at the tall one's hands. No gloves. A cop hauling a bleeding prisoner would have gloves. This one had a ring on his right hand and a bulge under his left arm that she knew, was not a taser. "Trauma 2, she said anyway, because you take the patient first and you ask the questions with your hands. "Let's move." They moved. Too smooth. Cops shuffle and argue and drop clipboards. These three flowed like they'd walked this hallway 100 times, and one of them peeled off to stand at the mouth of the corridor with his back to the wall and his eyes on the waiting room. Watching the exits. Nobody watches the exits for a prisoner who's already cuffed and bleeding out. They watch the exits when they're the danger in the room. Leona's pulse ticked up. She let none of it reach her face. "I need his paperwork," she said, snapping on gloves. "Transfer forms, custody sheet, all of it. It's coming. It comes now or he doesn't get treated. That's the law, not me." The tall one stared at her a beat too long. Then he pulled a folded sheet from his jacket and pushed it into her hand, and she unfolded it while Deborah came around the other side of the gurney with the vitals cart, and Leona read the top line and felt the floor tilt. The transfer facility was a county lockup 200 miles north. The transferring officer's signature was a scribble. The date was tomorrow's date, and the patient's name was typed as John Lee, which is the name you put on a form when you have never once cared what the man is actually called. She folded it back up, slow, kept her mouth easy. "Okay," she said, "let me get him stable." The man under the blanket had not made a sound. That was the part that got into her chest. A through-and-through gunshot to the hip is agony. It screams out of people. It makes grown men beg. This one lay still, with his jaw set and his breath coming shallow and controlled through his nose, riding the pain like a wave he'd decided not to let pull him under. His eyes were open, dark, half-lidded, fixed on the ceiling tile, aware, every muscle in his face doing the work of holding a scream behind his teeth. Leona pulled the blanket down to get at the wound, and her hand brushed the collar of his shirt, and she saw it. The neck, left side, ink so black it looked wet under the fluorescence. A fish, curving up, the tail sweeping back behind his ear in a stroke of scales, the body of it disappearing down under the ripped collar. A koi, coiled and climbing, drawn by someone who charged a fortune and took their time. She had cleaned a lot of tattoos in this room. Barbed wire, names of dead babies, gang letters cheap and blurred. She knew the difference between ink a man got in a garage and ink a man got somewhere that mattered. This was the second kind. This was a mark, and a man who wears a mark like that, cuffed to a gurney, unnamed, guarded by 3 men with guns and windbreakers that don't fit, is not a prisoner being delivered. He's a package being moved somewhere quiet to be finished. Her eyes came up off the fish and met his. He was watching her now. Not the ceiling, her. He'd felt her see it, felt the exact half-second her hand went still over his collar, and something moved behind those dark eyes, calculating, cold, fast. He knew what she'd understood, and he was waiting to see what she'd do with it. Neither of them said a word. "Sats are dropping," Deborah said. 89. He's losing more than this blanket's showing. "Pressure line, now," Leona said. She pressed a wad of gauze to the hip and leaned her weight in, and the man's breath hitched once, a single sharp pull through the nose, and held. She felt the wound under her palms. Entry high, exit lower and ragged, bleeding steady but not arterial, survivable. He would live, if she let him, if they let him. The tall one stepped up close to the gurney. "How long?" "As long as it takes." "We don't have long." He said it soft, right by her ear, and it wasn't a medical opinion. It was a countdown. "Patch him, we transport. 10 minutes. You don't transport a man who's still bleeding out, unless you don't care whether he arrives." Leona kept her hands on the wound and turned her head just enough. Down the corridor, the second man had drifted closer. The third still watched the doors, and she understood, the way you understand a thing all at once and completely, that these men were not going to let this stranger leave her trauma room, breathing under his own power. The transport was a drive to nowhere. This room, Her room was the last lit place this man would ever see if she handed him back stable and quiet and easy to move. She had 10 minutes to decide whether she was a nurse or a witness. "I need imaging," she said, straightening. "The exit wound's ragged. There could be fragment in the joint. If I move him wrong and he throws a clot, he codes in your van and you've got a corpse and a paper trail 200 miles from where you say you're going." She let that land. Let the tall one do the math on a body he'd have to explain. "Portable's down. I have to take him to the machine. 10 minutes there and back. You can stand outside the door." It was a lie built out of true-sounding bricks, and she watched him test each one. "He's cuffed," the tall one said. "To my gurney, which I am pushing. Where's he going to go? He can't stand." She was already unlocking the wheels. "You want him alive to transport. This is how. Or patch and pray and he dies on the interstate. Your call, officer." The word officer came out clean, no edge on it. She gave him the whole title like she believed it, and that, more than anything, was what turned him. Men who are pretending love to be treated like the thing they're pretending to be. He stepped back. "Two of us come. Radiology's a sealed suite. Magnets, no metal past the line. That means your weapons stay outside with you." She met his eyes flat. "Hospital policy. I don't write it." Another lie. She could have taken armed men to half the machines in the building. But he didn't know that, and Deborah, God bless her, was already nodding along beside her like they did this every night. "Deb, log him and roll," Leona said. They pushed the gurney out of Trauma 2 and into the corridor, and the tall one and the second man fell in behind, and the third stayed on the doors, and Leona walked her patient down the hall at a nurse's brisk, unhurried pace, with her heart going like a fist on a locked door. The man on the gurney watched her the whole way, still silent, but his cuffed hand, the one strapped to the rail, had turned over, palm up, fingers loose. Ready. He'd read her too. He knew this wasn't a trip to a machine. He was waiting for whatever she was about to do, and he was telling her, with the one hand he could move, that when she moved, he'd be there to move with her. The radiology corridor took a dogleg past the old imaging suite, the one they'd decommissioned when the new wing opened. Dark. Doors that still locked from a badge Leona wore on a lanyard, because nobody had ever taken her access away. Past that, a service stairwell that dumped into the loading dock. She knew this floor in the dark. She'd walked it half dead 1,000 nights. The two men behind her did not. "Suites around this bend," she said. "Prep lines here. You wait at the yellow tape." There was no yellow tape. There was a light switch panel, a whole bank of them, the master for the wing, and Leona had been walking toward it since she'd seen the fish on his neck. She stopped the gurney at the mouth of the dark corridor, turned like she was going to say something to the tall one, and hit the panel with the flat of her hand. The wing went black. Not dim, black. The old suite had no windows, and the emergency lights on that dead stretch had been unbudgeted for 2 years. She'd filed the complaint herself, and now the dark came down like a dropped curtain, and the tall one swore, and the second man's hand went to his jacket, and Leona was already moving. She grabbed the rail and hauled the gurney forward into the black, fast, the wheels she'd unlocked rolling clean, and she felt the man's cuffed hand close over hers on the rail and pull with her, throwing his own weight into the roll, and the two of them shot the gurney down the dead corridor, by memory alone, while behind them, 2 armed men grabbed at a darkness that had swallowed the thing they were guarding. "Keys," the man breathed. First word out of him, low, rough, an accent under it. The cuff, keys, don't have them. She banged the gurney through the swing door of the dead suite, spun it. Don't need them. She'd worked trauma 8 years. She'd cut people out of cars and cuffs, and clothing melted to skin. She had trauma shears on her hip that went through a penny. The cuff was steel, but the gurney rail it was locked to was hollow aluminum, a strut she'd seen bend under a 200-pound seizure, and she jammed her weight against it at the weld and felt it give. Down the corridor, a flashlight beam swung wild, hunting. "Hey! Hey! Up!" she hissed. "Can you stand?" He was already swinging his legs off the gurney, dragging the cuffed wrist and the rail with it, the whole strut torn free in his fist, blood sheeting down his hip, and he stood. Swayed, locked his knees by force of will, and stood there, in the black 6 inches from her, breathing hard, that fish on his neck, the only thing she could almost see, and he looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Not thank you, why?" She didn't have an answer that fit in the 2 seconds they had. She barely had one for herself. She thought of a form that said tomorrow's date. She thought of 3 men who watched the exits. She thought of the porch with 1 chair on it, and a God she still talked to, and the simple animal certainty that had risen in her the second she saw the ink. This one is not supposed to die tonight, and I am the only one standing between him and the men who decided he was. "Service stairs," she said instead, and shoved a badge into his good hand. "End of the hall. Push the bar. It dumps at the loading dock. Go left. The dark side, not the ramp." She closed his fingers around the lanyard. "This gets you through the dock door. Drop it in the storm drain after. Don't let them see the fish." The flashlight beam hit the swing door behind them and bounced. "Go," she said. He went. 1 hand pressed to his hip, the torn rail wrapped in the blanket to keep it from ringing against the wall, and he moved down that black corridor, fast and low and silent, a man who had done quiet violence in the dark before and knew exactly how to become part of it. At the stairwell door he stopped, looked back once. She couldn't see his face. She felt it. Then the bar clunked, and he was gone, and the corridor was empty, and Leona turned around to face 2 men with guns, and a story she had 90 seconds to build. She grabbed the empty gurney, threw herself half over it, and when the flashlight found her, she was on the floor beside it, clutching her own head, gasping, the picture of a woman who'd been knocked flat in the dark. "He hit me," she choked out. "He got loose. He hit me. He went that way." She flung a hand toward the far doors, the ambulance bay, the opposite direction from the stairwell. He ran. Oh God, he ran for the front. He had the rail. Which way? The bay. The bay. He went out the bay. The tall one hauled her up by the arm, hard enough to bruise, his face inches from hers in the flashlight glare, reading her. And Leona gave him the one thing 8 years of watching people die had made her better at than any liar he'd ever met. She gave him a real face, real fear. Not fake fear for a fake story, but the true terror still ringing in her body from the last 90 seconds, pointed at him now like a lamp, and he bought it because it was real. It just wasn't about what he thought. He let her go, barked something in Korean at the second man, and the 2 of them ran, guns out now, straight for the ambulance bay, straight away from the stairwell, straight away from the stairwell, straight away from the stairwell, toward the dark side of a loading dock, 200 miles from the county lockup, where a form said he was already supposed to be. Leona sat down on the floor of the dead suite in the dark. Her hands were shaking. She let them. Nobody was watching now, and the after always came, the flood the job holds back until the work is done. She pressed her back to the cold wall and breathed, and somewhere in the building an alarm she hadn't pulled started up, and there were shouts, and running, and she stayed on the floor of the dark room and did not move. She had just helped a stranger escape from men who called themselves police. She'd falsified nothing on paper, touched no gun, but she'd blacked out a wing and lied to armed men and put a hospital badge in a bleeding fugitive's hand, and if any part of tonight came apart, she would lose the license she'd bled for, and maybe the house too. The house with the letter in the delivery drawer. The house that was already, somehow, under threat from a name she didn't know. She should have felt sick. She reached up and closed her hand around the cross at her throat and waited for the sick to come, and it didn't. What came instead was quiet. The same clean quiet she'd felt in the closet with the blue-lidded box. The quiet of having done the one thing that was actually hers to do. Her palms still smelled of his blood, copper and warm. She turned them over in the dim and looked at the dark under her nails, and she thought about the sound he'd made, which was no sound, a man riding a bullet wound the whole ride into her floor, and never once letting it out. People who don't scream have learned somewhere that screaming costs them. She'd met a few. None of them had ever thanked her for anything either. They asked why, the way he had, because a kindness they hadn't paid for was the only kind they couldn't read. Down the hall, the lights snapped back on. Somebody had found the master panel. Leona got to her feet, straightened her blue scrubs, wiped her face with the back of a wrist, and when Deborah came skidding around the dogleg with 2 security guards behind her, breathless, wild-eyed, "Leona, Leona, are you?" She was already walking toward them steady, badge gone, gurney empty, her story whole. "Prisoner assaulted a nurse and fled," she heard one of the guards say into his radio. "Escorts in pursuit. We need a lockdown." Escort, not officers. Somebody upstairs was already smelling the same wrong she had. Leona let Deborah wrap an arm around her and walk her back toward the light of the main floor, and she answered the questions coming at her in a low, flat, traumatized voice. Yes, he hit her. No, she didn't see his face. No, she didn't know how he got loose. And every word of it was a brick in the wall she was building around a man whose name she didn't know and whose fish she would see behind her eyes every time she closed them for a week. She did not know his name. She did not know he was Jang Tae-sung. She did not know they called him the Quiet One, or that the men in the windbreakers belonged to someone who wanted him gone, or that in 3 nights a black car would come slow up her short street and stop in front of a house with 1 chair on the porch, and that the man inside it, hip-stitched by someone else's hands now, would have spent every one of those 3 nights finding out exactly who the nurse was who'd cut the lights. She knew none of that yet. She knew she was tired, and that her hands had stopped shaking, and that for the first time in a year, she'd walked out of trauma 2 carrying something instead of setting it down at the door. She clocked out at 7. The sun was coming up over the parking lot, hard and gold and ordinary, and Leona sat in her car with both hands on the wheel and did not start it for a long minute. Then she pulled the visor down against the light, backed out of her space, and drove the 20 minutes home to the house that was already, though she still didn't understand how, sitting square in the middle of a war she hadn't been told she was in. Behind her, in a storm drain by a loading dock, a hospital badge on a lanyard lay face down in an inch of black water, exactly where she'd told him to drop it. The black car was already parked when Leona pulled onto her street 3 nights later, and she saw it the way she saw a rhythm break on a monitor. Before she understood it, her body knew something was off. It sat at the dead end past her mailbox, engine cold, no lights, angled so it faced the way out. She slowed the sedan to a crawl. Her hand found the door lock without asking permission. She could have kept driving, circled the block, called someone, waited for headlights behind her. She parked in her own driveway instead, killed the engine, and sat with her keys threaded between her fingers, the way the self-defense pamphlet in the break room said to. The driver's door of the black car opened. 1 man got out. He stood, and he stayed by the car, didn't cross the grass, didn't close the distance, kept a full lawn of open dark between them. She knew the shoulders before she knew the face. She knew the way he held still. "You're limping less," she said through the cracked window. It came out flat, a clinician noting a chart. Inside her chest, something kicked hard against her ribs. You did good work, Jung Taesung said. 4 nights ago, she had cut a stranger loose in a dead corridor and sent him bleeding down a stairwell with her own badge. Now that stranger was standing on her lawn in a dark Henley, the koi on his neck a black smear under the streetlight, saying her stitching had held. Her stitching. Somebody else had closed the hip. He'd found out whose hands started it anyway. How did you get my street? She said. I'm careful about who I let find things. He let that sit. I made an exception. For me, not for anyone else. That was the part she'd chew on later. Not that he'd found her, that he wanted her to know he'd worked to, and that the work stopped at his own hands. You shouldn't be here. I know. He didn't move toward the house. I came to say one word, and then I leave. You choose if there's a second time. She waited. Thank you, he said. 2 syllables. No weight of debt hung off them. No offer. No card slid under a door. He said it the way you'd set something breakable on a table, carefully, then step back from it. Leona's thumb worked the cross at her throat. 8 years of triage had taught her to read a face for the lie underneath the calm, and she read his now, hard, looking for the angle. She found a man who'd been shot 4 nights ago, standing very straight so she wouldn't see it cost him. You drove here to say thank you, she said. Yes. Most men would have sent flowers. And flowers tell your neighbors someone was thinking about you. He almost smiled. It didn't finish. I don't leave things on your porch. She should have told him to leave and not come back. That was the correct line, the safe line, the one Deborah would have made her rehearse. She rolled the window down another 2 inches instead. Go home, she said. You're still healing. You keep standing like that, you'll tear something. He caught it, that she'd seen the effort under the posture, and something in his face loosened a half degree. He got back in the black car. He didn't gun it, didn't linger. The taillights swung out of the dead end and were gone before she'd gotten her own front door open. She stood in her hallway with her back against the closed door and listened to her own pulse for a while. Then she went and checked the lock on the kitchen window she never checked and told herself it meant nothing. He called 4 days after that. She didn't know how he had the number, and she asked, and he told her. A hospital directory, a name she'd given the county lockup escort as a bluff. One thread pulled honestly. No listening device, no bot contact. He offered the whole chain of it before she finished asking. Like he'd decided in advance she'd want the receipt. The calls came after her shifts. That was the strange, specific thing about them. Not noon, not the middle of her sleep. He'd learned when she clocked out, and he called into that dead hour when the adrenaline of a night in the ER hadn't drained yet, and the house was too quiet to sit in. She'd be peeling off the blue scrubs, standing in her kitchen with the phone against her shoulder, and his voice would be there, low, unhurried, asking what had come through the doors. She told him. That was the thing she couldn't explain to herself. A 19-year-old with a screwdriver through his palm. A woman who'd swallowed a bottle of something and lived and wept that she'd lived. The idiot who'd lost a thumb to a table saw and drove himself in holding it in a bag of frozen corn. Leona talked, and the man on the other end didn't fill the silences with advice or comfort. He just kept the line open, and every so often he'd say a thing that told her he'd been listening under the words. You carry all of them home, he said one night. I don't. You just told me the boy's name, and the sawman's, and the woman who lived. A pause. No accusation in it. You carry them. She didn't answer that. She switched the phone to the other shoulder and looked at the drawer where the delivery menus were, where the folded letter was, and left it shut. Some nights he was the one who talked. Never much, never long. A thing he'd seen a courier do at a loading dock that made him respect the man. The way a hotel lobby went quiet at 3 a.m, and how he liked to walk through it then, when it belonged to no one. Small windows onto a life she couldn't see the shape of. She caught herself building the shape anyway, the way she'd build a diagnosis off 3 symptoms, and every version she built had rooms in it she couldn't account for. "You work strange hours," she said once. "So do you. I have a badge and a schedule. You have a—" She stopped. "What do you have?" The line went quiet a beat too long. "People who need decisions made when other people are asleep," he said. And then, before she could press the seam of it, "How's the boy with the hand?" She let him turn her, because it was easier, and because the tired hour didn't want to fight. But she noticed the turn, she filed it. He never asked about Marcus. She noticed the shape of the absence more than she'd have noticed a question. Men, when they circled a widow, either avoided the dead husband like a live wire or dug at him to measure the grave. Taesong did neither. When she mentioned Marcus, and she did, once, the wedding ring she still moved to her right hand on long shifts so it wouldn't catch a glove. He received the name and set it down gently and left it exactly where she'd put it. He never once asked her to move it, cover it, explain it away. "You were married," was all he said. 4 years, widow for 1. "Then you know how to love something all the way through," he said. "Most people don't finish." She had to put the phone down on the counter for a second after that one. The dinner was his ask, and he made it the way he did everything, leaving her the exit. "There's a place I go where nobody watches me eat," he said. "You'd be safe there. You can say no and I stop calling. You can say no and I still call. You decide which." She said yes, and hated a little that saying it felt like exhaling. The restaurant was Japanese, tucked behind an unmarked door in a part of the city she'd only ever driven through with the doors locked. No sign. A woman bowed him in by name, a name that wasn't Taesong, she caught that, and led them to a room screened off from the rest. A low table, a single hanging light. Leona had worn the green dress, the emerald wrap she hadn't taken off the hanger in 2 years, and she'd stood in front of the mirror a long time, deciding whether wearing it was a betrayal of somebody. The cross sat in the hollow of her throat over the satin. She'd kept that on. That was the compromise she made with the woman in the glass. Taesong stood when she came in. He wore the navy knit, collar loose, and the koi rode up out of it when he turned his head. He looked at the dress and then, deliberately, at her face, and kept his eyes there. "You look like yourself," he said, "not like someone dressed up." That a compliment? It's the only kind I know how to give. The food came in courses she didn't order and couldn't name. He watched her eat more than he ate, and she caught him at it. "You're not hungry. I like watching you decide you're allowed to enjoy it," he said. "You take one bite like you're checking it for a trap, then you let go. Occupational habit." She set down the chopsticks. "I check everything for a trap. So do I." He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the wood. "It's a tiring way to eat dinner." She laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising her, too loud in the quiet room, and pressed her fingers to her mouth like she could catch it and put it back. He didn't smile at the laugh. He looked at her like a man watching weather he'd waited a long time for. "You don't do that often," he said. "No? Your face doesn't know what to do with it. Neither do I." She picked the chopsticks back up so her hands had a job. "It's been a while since anything was funny," he told her, over the last course, one true thing about himself, and she understood it was a payment, that he'd counted out all the small confessions she'd made on the phone and decided he owed her one of equal weight. "I had a brother," he said, "older. He died when I was 19. After that, I stopped being the kind of person who tells people things." He turned the glass again. "You're the first in a long time I've wanted to." He didn't say how the brother died. She didn't ask. She recognized the shape of a door left closed on purpose, because she had a closet full of them. "Why me?" she said, when the plates had been cleared and the room had gone still around them. "You could thank a nurse with a fruit basket. You keep showing up." He considered it like a question that deserved the truth. "The night in your hospital, I was cargo. Everyone in that room had already decided what I was and where I was going. You looked at me and decided something different, and you were right, and it cost you to be right." He turned the glass. "I've been powerful a long time. Nobody's decided anything about me for free in years. You did it for a stranger. I wanted to know the person who'd do that. And now you know her. Now I'm learning her." He didn't reach across the table. He kept his hands to himself with a discipline she recognized as effort. Slowly, you don't rush someone who checks food for traps. He drove her home himself. No driver, no black car. A plain gray sedan, and she noted that too, that he'd left the vehicle that announced him at home. He drove the speed limit. He kept both hands where she could see them. At her curb, he put the car in park and made no move at all, waiting, giving her the door, and the moment, and the decision. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for the dress." She went inside and stood in the dark hallway again, and this time she was smiling before she caught herself, and she caught herself, and she stopped. The car rides became a thing that existed. Not every night. He'd call, and sometimes the call became him idling at her curb an hour later, and she'd come out in the cream sweater and jeans and get in, and they'd drive nowhere in particular. Those were the hours she confessed the small things. That she moved the ring, that she'd doubled a shift so she wouldn't have to be home on a Tuesday, that she prayed for a specific thing she wouldn't name. He drove and listened, and gave back a piece of himself for every piece she set down, and never once, in any of it, did he tell her to grieve less, or move faster, or make room for him. One of those rides she told him about the Tuesday. Not the whole of it, just that Marcus had died on a Tuesday, and that she now arranged her weeks so she was never home on one, that she'd trade shifts and beg favors and stand in the bright ER for 16 hours rather than sit in that quiet house on the day of the week that took him. He drove a full block before he answered. "You don't have to be home on Tuesdays," he said. "You have to be somewhere, there's a difference. One is running, the other is choosing. And which am I doing? Running." For now, he signaled a turn she hadn't asked for, took the long way back. "I'm not going to tell you to stop. I ran for years after my brother. Nobody could have talked me out of it. You come out the other side when you come out, not when someone hurries you." She looked at his hands on the wheel, steady, patient, and felt something in her chest she hadn't given permission to. That was the thing that should have warned her, if she'd been thinking like the woman who checked escorts for fraud. A man who never pushed on the door was a man who'd already decided he could open it whenever he wanted. Deborah said it out loud in the break room before Leona had let herself think it. "Girl, you're humming." Leona kept her back to her, restocking the drawer of gauze. "I'm not humming. You've been humming for a week and a half, and you doubled the Ferris kids' dose to 0 from what I can tell, so I know you're not sleeping, so it's a man." Deborah pulled her reading glasses down the bead chain. "Sit." Leona sat. "Talk." So she talked. Not all of it. Not the corridor, not the tattoo, not the badge in a storm drain. She gave Deborah the version that could exist. A man, careful, kind, older, quiet, who called after her shifts and drove her nowhere, and asked nothing. Deborah listened to the whole thing with her arms crossed and her mouth getting flatter, and when Leona ran out, she asked one question. "What's he do?" Leona opened her mouth, closed it. "Uh-huh," Deborah said. "He has businesses. Logistics. Some hotels, I think." "You think?" Deborah leaned in. "Baby, I raised 4 kids and buried my mother, and I have never once, not one time, met a man with real money and no job you can name who turned out to be a blessing. A man that has that much and works that little is a question. And you're a woman who answers questions for a living, so why is this the one you're not asking? Leona touched the cross. He's never lied to me. That you know of. He tells me how he found things before I ask him. That's not honesty. Deborah's voice dropped, gentler, which was worse. That's a man showing you the clean version, so you stop looking for the dirty one. I'm not saying he's bad. I'm saying you're a smart woman, standing in front of a locked door, telling me it's fine, because he keeps handing you keys to the other rooms. Leona didn't have an answer that wasn't an argument, so she didn't make one. Deborah squeezed her wrist once, hard, and let go. Just ask him what he is, she said. Watch his face when he answers. You know how to read a face. Leona drove home with that sitting in the passenger seat, where he usually sat. She let herself into the quiet house. She went to the kitchen for water, and her eyes went to the drawer the way they had every night for 2 weeks, and this time, because Deborah had put a splinter under her skin about locked doors, she opened it. The letter was where she'd folded it. Residual balance due, the second name she didn't know, the LLC. She'd told herself she would call the servicer in the morning, and then a man had shown up on her lawn, and the morning had become other things, and the letter had sat in the dark under the takeout menus getting realer while she wasn't looking. She unfolded it. She read the line about proceedings against the property. She read the unfamiliar name again. Her house. The one she and Marcus had signed 30 years of their lives to. The one the insurance had paid clean when he died. She had the letter that said 0. She had it in the fireproof box. She'd held it in her hands. 2 letters. One said she owned it free. One said she owed a stranger money on it. Both could not be true. She stood there in the kitchen with the phone in her free hand before she'd decided to reach for it, and she scrolled to his name, and she stopped with her thumb over it. Because here was the thing she hadn't let herself line up until Deborah made her. The letter had come the same week the black car found her street. She had assumed those were 2 separate weathers. Standing in her kitchen at 4 in the morning, with a fraudulent balance in one hand and a man she couldn't name in her phone, she felt, for the first time, the cold suspicion that they might be one storm. She didn't call him. She photographed both letters, the one that said 0 and the one that said she owed, laid side by side on the counter under the good light, and she texted the images to nobody yet, just held them. Then she got a pen and a legal pad, and did the thing she was good at, the thing she'd done at the county lockup escort's paperwork, with a bleeding man on her table. She started listing the inconsistencies. Wrong name, LLC with no phone number she could find, a balance on a mortgage a death had erased, a demand with a deadline and no signature that meant anything. Agency, even at 4 in the morning, even scared. She would not call the careful man and hand him her fear. She would find out what the letter was first, on her own, and then she would decide who got to know. What she didn't know, couldn't know, standing there building her list, was that the man she wasn't calling had a copy of the same LLC's name on a different desk across the city, and had spent 3 nights already pulling the thread, and had recognized the second name on her letter before she ever would. He had started, quietly, without asking her, to take the storm apart from his end. She capped the pen. She looked at the 2 letters lying side by side, the true one and the false one, and she understood that one of them was a lie somebody had built on purpose, and that lies built on purpose came from somewhere, and that somewhere had reached into her house. She turned off the good light. She left both letters on the counter where she could see them in the morning, and for the first time since a stranger had asked her why, in a dark corridor, and she hadn't answered, Leona wondered if the answer to that question and the answer to the letter were the same man. By 9 the next morning, Leona was standing in the servicer's branch office, with both letters in a folder and a number written on her hand in pen. She'd slept 3 hours. She didn't care. The woman behind the counter had a nameplate and a headset and a smile that ran out of gas the second Leona slid the 2 letters across the glass side by side. "These can't both be real," Leona said. "One says my balance is 0. One says I owe 81,000 to a company I've never heard of." The woman typed, then she stopped typing, then she typed slower, like the keyboard had turned to something she didn't trust. Her eyes moved across the screen twice. "Ma'am, this account," she said, "it shows a lien filed against the property, filed 3 weeks ago. A lien from who? An entity, Meridian Crest Holdings, LLC." She said the name the way you say a stranger's name at a funeral. "Carefully," wrong-mouthed. Leona put her finger on the 0 balance letter. "This one has your company's letterhead, your seal, your signature line. It says the insurance policy cleared the mortgage the month my husband died." "I see that letter." "Then explain the other one." The woman looked at the second letter for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped under the counter. "Private. The voice people use when they've decided to help you against the building they work in. I can't explain it. The payoff on our end is complete. This lien didn't originate here. Somebody recorded it at the county with documents that reference your loan number. Whoever did it had your loan number, your husband's death certificate date, the original principal, all of it correct." She swallowed. "You should get a lawyer. Today." Leona drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, in the spot where a person would sit. She kept glancing at it. Somebody had her loan number. Somebody had the date Marcus died. Somebody had built a paper knife out of the worst week of her life and pressed it against the only wall she had left. She did not call Taesong. She wanted to. She noticed she wanted to, and the noticing scared her more than the letter did. Across the city, in a room with the blinds down and a single lamp, Ryu Seokjin set a folder on the desk and stepped back without a word. Taesong opened it. Inside were photographs of documents, county recording stamps, and one printed corporate filing with a name at the top. He read it once. His jaw shifted a quarter inch. That was the whole reaction. To anyone who didn't know him, it looked like nothing. Seokjin knew him. Seokjin took a slow breath through his nose. "Meridian Crest," Taesong said. "Who's behind the shell? 3 layers deep it's clean. 4 layers deep it isn't." Seokjin reached over and turned to the last page. A signature, not a name Leona would ever recognize. A name Taesong recognized before his eyes finished crossing it. "Bae Do-hyun," Taesong said. "Bae Do-hyun," Seokjin agreed. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the lamp buzzed, and the city went on outside the blinds not knowing anything. Bae Do-hyun. The man who'd spent 2 years trying to peel Taesong's freight routes off the coast, one contract at a time. The man who smiled in rooms and filed papers in the dark. The man whose men had wheeled a wounded package into a hospital 3 weeks ago, wearing windbreakers, with the letters put on crooked. Taesong had wondered, that night on the gurney, who had wanted him dead badly enough to fake a transfer to a county lockup 200 miles north. Now he had the whole shape of it. Bae Do-hyun hadn't just tried to kill him. Bae Do-hyun had followed the thread the failed hit left behind. The nurse who cut a man off a rail in the dark. The woman the great quiet boss came back to say one word to, and Bae Do-hyun had found her house. "He's not coming for me," Taesong said. "He's coming for her. To pull me into the open." Seokjin didn't argue. He'd read the same file. The lien wasn't about $81,000. Bae Do-hyun didn't need $81,000. The lien was a hook with a woman on the end of it, and the whole point of a hook is what comes to bite. "He wants me to show up," Taesong said, loud, somewhere with a paper trail. He wants me standing in front of her house so the whole world can watch the quiet one bleed over a nurse. He closed the folder. Then he takes the house, takes the routes, takes the name, and she loses everything either way. He stood at the window a while. Below, headlights slid past in both directions, people going home to houses that were only houses. He thought about a counter with 2 letters on it. He thought about a woman who read fraud, the way other people read a clock. She'd already found it. He was sure of that. She'd found it and she hadn't called him. And that was the part that told him the most. She'd found it and gone quiet. The way he went quiet. The way you go quiet when you've decided you're the only one you can trust. Put people on her street, Taesung said. Tonight. Seokjin's eyes came up. How many? Enough. Not visible. Nobody in black. Nobody who looks like us. He turned from the window. A man walking a dog. A woman waiting in a parked car with grocery bags. Somebody fixing a porch light 2 doors down. If Bae Do-hyun's people so much as slow down on that block, I want to know the color of their shoes. And her? Taesung didn't answer right away. Does she know we're there? He'd been at Taesung's shoulder for 11 years, and in 11 years he had learned exactly when to push and exactly when not to, and he pushed now, once, because it was his job to be the one voice in the room. She's smart. If she catches a stranger on her street, she'll read it in one look. She reads everything. You said so yourself. Then tell them to be better than she is. Taesung. Seokjin rarely used the name. If she finds out we planted men around her house without telling her, then she finds out. His voice didn't rise. It went flatter, which was worse. I'm not going to let Bae Do-hyun put a woman in the ground to make a point about me. She lives through this. Whatever she thinks of me after, she lives through this. Seokjin picked up the folder. At the door he stopped. You're deciding for her. Yes, Taesung said. I am. Seokjin left. Within 2 hours, the street where Leona slept had grown quiet people it had never had before. A woman parked at the curb, with paper grocery bags on the passenger seat, and a phone she never lifted. A man walked a borrowed dog up and down the block, letting it sniff the same 3 mailboxes until the routine stopped looking like a routine and started looking like a neighbor. On the corner, a utility van sat with a work order taped to its dash, and 2 men inside who did not touch the coffee going cold between them. None of them wore black. None of them looked at her windows more than a passing man would. They mapped the block the way you map a thing you intend to hold. Every parked car logged, every plate run, every set of headlights that slowed measured against a list. Seokjin ran it from the van. He'd argued his one argument and lost it, and now he did his job, because that was the shape of 11 years. He watched a porch light 2 doors down from the nurse's house and put his best pair of eyes on the ladder under it. A man who could stand on a rung all night and look bored, and he thought about the fact that his boss had just moved an entire perimeter around a woman who did not know she was being guarded, and that when she found out, and she would find out, because Taesung had said so himself, she read everything. The thing they were building to protect her might be the exact thing she never forgave. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight the only job was that she went on breathing behind glass that didn't quite fit its frame, unaware, in a house that had quietly become the center of a war between 2 men, only one of whom she'd ever let inside. She went into the hospital at 3 for a swing shift she'd half hoped would drown the whole thing out, and it didn't, because Deborah took one look at her across the medroom and put down the chart she was holding. You've got a face, Deborah said. I've got a lien on my house. Deborah's reading glasses came off their beaded cord and hung against her scrubs. A what? Somebody forged a debt onto my property. My mortgage is paid. Marcus's insurance cleared it a year ago. I have the letter, and somebody built a fake one on top of it with my loan number and Marcus's death date and a notary stamp that the notary says she never made. Leona said it flat, the way she'd learned to give bad news to families, all the weight in the plainness. Somebody who knew everything about the worst year of my life reached into it and made a weapon. Deborah didn't reach for comfort. She'd buried her mother and raised 4 children, and she knew that some news you don't hug, you sharpen against. Who knew all that? Leona didn't answer. Baby, Deborah said, quieter, who did you let know all that? The refrigerated hum of the medroom filled the space where Leona's answer should have gone. Deborah watched her not answer, and her mouth went thin, and she said, the careful one, the one who calls after your shifts and doesn't push, the one who does logistics. She put weight on the last word like it was rotten fruit. I told you a man with money and no job you can name is a question. I didn't think the question was going to knock on your house. I don't know that it's him. You don't know that it isn't. No, Leona said, I don't. And that was the whole thing, wasn't it? She'd spent a year keeping people at arm's length, keeping the ocean behind its door, keeping even Deborah on the far side of the real grief. And the one time she'd let a stranger walk in close, the stranger's world had walked in with him and put its hands on her walls. Deborah touched her wrist, once, and let go. Get a lawyer, tonight. And Leona, lock your doors. Leona had already planned to. Hearing someone else say it out loud made the floor tilt half a degree. Leona spent the rest of that afternoon on the phone with a legal aid line, and then with a lawyer Deborah's cousin knew, a tired man named Okafor, who took her photos by email and called her back within the hour, which lawyers did not do unless something was wrong. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, your payoff is legitimate. I pulled the county record while we talked. There is a lien against your property, recorded, notarized, referencing your exact loan. The notary stamp belongs to a real notary in a strip mall who, when my paralegal called, said she has no record of the signing. He let that sit. That's fabrication. That's forgery of a public instrument. It's a crime, and it's also a very expensive crime, which means whoever did it wanted the house more than they were afraid of getting caught, or they wanted something the house gets them. Leona stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and looked at the gaveta where the menus were, the drawer she'd hidden the first letter in weeks ago, like hiding it would make it less true. How long do I have, she said. Before what? Before someone comes to take it. Okafor paused, and the pause told her he'd heard the real question under the question, that she wasn't asking about court dates. Legally, months. A lien like this has to be foreclosed through a process, and I can freeze it Monday morning with an emergency filing. Another pause. Mrs. Whitfield, are you safe? Is there a reason you asked it like that? She thought about the man on the gurney, the tattoo climbing his neck, the 3 men with the crooked letters running the wrong way down her instruction into the dark, the black car angled to leave at the end of her street, a dinner in a room with no sign where a woman had called him a name that wasn't his. No reason, she said. I'll see you Monday. She hung up and stood there and let the whole thing turn over in her hands one more time. Somebody had her loan number. Somebody knew Marcus died on a Tuesday. Somebody had been close enough to her life to reach into it and pull out the exact worst thread and make a rope out of it, and she had let exactly one new person close to her life in a year. One, a careful man with clean hands, and a story with rooms that didn't connect, and a tattoo that meant he belonged to something that marked its own. She didn't want it to be him. She wanted that with a force that surprised her, and the wanting was the flag. She'd taught herself years ago that the thing you most needed to not be true was the thing you had to check first. So she checked. She sat at the counter with her notebook, the same notebook where she'd listed the inconsistencies in the letter, and she wrote down everything she actually knew about the man she'd been driving nowhere with at night. Courier, loading dock, A hotel lobby at 3 in the morning. People who need decisions when everyone else is asleep. A restaurant with no sign. A woman who greeted him by another name. Money with no visible job under it. A brother who died when he was 19, and after that he stopped telling people things. A tattoo that a hospital full of people had seen and that 3 armed men had come to erase, along with the body it was on. She looked at the list. She'd made lists exactly like it before. She made them about patients whose stories didn't close, about escorts whose paperwork lied. She knew what it felt like when the pieces refused to make an innocent picture. This was that feeling. She'd been carrying it for weeks and calling it something softer. "He's not a courier," she said out loud, to the empty kitchen, and hearing her own voice say it made her hand go up to the cross at her throat. She didn't cry. She never did. She sat with it dry-eyed the way she sat with everything, and the ocean stayed behind its locked door, and she pressed the cross flat against her collarbone until the edges of it hurt. Then she got up and did the thing that told her the most about herself. She checked the locks. Front, back, the window over the sink that never sat right in its frame. She stood at that window a second longer than the check required, looking out at the dark yard, the short street, the dead end where a black car had once sat angled to leave. There was a truck parked 3 houses down that she didn't recognize. A man on a ladder against a porch, working on a light fixture at 9:40 at night. He wasn't hurrying. Nobody fixes a porch light at 9:40 at night without hurrying, unless the porch light is not the reason he's on the ladder. Leona stood very still behind her own glass and watched him not fix the light. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't look at it right away. When she did, it was him. It was Tae-song. The screen said his name, the name she'd typed in weeks ago, before she'd known there was any question about whether it was his, and it lit up her dark kitchen, and she let it ring, while she watched a stranger pretend to work 2 doors down from where she slept. She thought, he knows. Whatever this is, he knows more than I do, and he's calling me at 9:40 at night, for the first time, not after a shift. She thought, the man on the ladder is not Bae Do-hyun's. The man on the ladder is his. She didn't know the name Bae Do-hyun yet. She only knew there were 2 kinds of strangers on a street, the kind who come to take and the kind who come to stop the taking, and that she had somehow, without agreeing to any of it, ended up living in the exact narrow space between them, her house, her locks, her window that never sat right. A battlefield she hadn't been told she was standing on. The phone stopped ringing, started again. His name, twice. She picked it up on the second ring of the second call, and she did not say hello. She stood at the window, watching the man on the ladder, and she said the only thing worth saying. "There's a man fixing a light that isn't broken outside my house," Leona said. "Is he yours?" The line was quiet. Not dead. She could hear a room behind him, the particular hush of a place with the blinds down. She'd learned to hear rooms through phones from a year of him. She heard him decide whether to lie. She heard him decide whether to lie. She heard him decide whether to lie. "Yes," Tae-song said. Leona closed her eyes. Outside, the man on the ladder tilted his head, listening to something in his ear, and climbed down, unhurried, and walked to the truck, and did not drive away. "Don't hang up," Tae-song said. His voice had changed. Not louder, lower and level. The voice she now understood was the real one, the one under the courier, and the loading dock, and all the rooms that didn't connect. "Leona, listen to me. Whatever you found today, you're right, all of it. But I need you to stay inside tonight, and I need you to not open your door for anyone. Not police, not a process server, not anyone with paper. Do you understand me?" She opened her eyes. The truck sat there with its lights off and a man inside it watching her street, so that she could keep breathing in her own bed. "Who are you?" Leona said. Not a scream, barely above the hum of the refrigerator, the most dangerous voice she owned. And in the quiet before he answered, in the hitch of a man deciding how much of a year to unmake in a single sentence, Leona already knew that whatever came next, the letter on her counter and the man on her phone, had been the same storm the whole time. She'd read every stranger who ever came through her doors. She'd read the fake escort in a single glance, and she had missed the one who mattered, because she'd wanted, just once, to be wrong about a man. She held the phone and watched the dark truck sit at the end of her street, and she waited for him to tell her what she already, finally, understood, that she had loved a piece of the weather. He came to the door 40 minutes after the call ended, and he came alone. Leona watched him cross the porch through the window over the sink, the one that never sat right in its frame. No black car this time. He'd walked the last block. She saw the shape of him under the porch light, before she saw the face, and even before the face, she knew the walk. That even weight he carried like a man who'd trained himself never to look like he was in a hurry. She opened the door before he knocked. For a second, neither of them said anything. He stood on the mat in a black Henley and a dark jacket, collar open, the koi riding up out of the neckline the way it always did. She had the door half behind her body, one bare foot on the cold threshold, Henley sleeves pushed to the elbow, joggers soft at the ankle. The cross sat on her chest and caught the light. "You told me to stay inside," she said. "So I'm inside. And you're on my porch. I need to be in the house tonight." He didn't reach for the door. He let her hold it. "I'm asking. If you tell me no, I stay on the street, and I still don't leave." She looked at him a long beat. Then she stepped back and let the door swing. He came in the way he did everything. Quiet, economical, taking up less room than a man his size should. He didn't sit. He walked the front rooms first, the way a plumber reads pipe, eyes going to the windows, the back door, the gap under the blinds. She stood in the middle of her own living room and watched a man map her house for danger, and something in her chest pulled tight, because she knew that walk too. She'd done it herself 3 hours ago, checking every lock. "How many?" she said. Not a question about whether. About how many. He stopped at the kitchen window, looked out at the street, where the strange truck sat dark at the dead end. "Tonight, they think you're alone. So, enough to knock on a door and scare a woman into signing. Not enough to fight. That's the mistake I need them to keep making." Them. She folded her arms. The people from the letter. Yes. The people who put a man in cuffs in my hospital. His jaw moved. Yes. She'd promised herself, on the phone, that she'd stop asking questions he half answered. She broke the promise in her own kitchen. "And you knew. This whole time. The letter came the same week you found my street. You knew they were connected before I did." "I knew this morning," he turned from the window. "I knew for certain this morning. I've suspected longer. I didn't tell you because—" He stopped. Started again, cleaner. "Because I decided you were safer not carrying it. That was mine to decide," I told myself. "We'll come back to whether I was right. Not tonight." "No," she said. "Not tonight." Because the truck was still sitting there, and her hands were steady, and a woman learns which fights keep till morning. He asked for the lights. Not off, low. She turned the kitchen down to the one bulb over the stove and killed the rest. He moved a chair so it faced the front door instead of the table. He took the jacket off, folded it once over the back of the chair, and under it there was nothing on his hip, nothing under his arm, no weight anywhere on him that a body reads as steel. She noticed. She noticed everything. "You're not carrying." "No." "Why not?" "Because a gun near this house is a mistake I won't make." He sat where he could see the door. If it comes to metal on this street, I've already lost the thing I came to protect, so there's no metal. Not from mine, not tonight. She didn't understand yet how much that sentence cost him to make true. She'd understand later, when she counted the men and did the math. They waited. Not long. The knock came at 10:52. 3 raps, patient, almost polite, the knock of a man who'd read a script that told him this was a scared widow with a dead husband's mortgage, and no reason on earth to expect 8 bodies in the dark. Tae-song was up before the 3rd rap finished, one hand flat toward her. Stay, and he moved her by the shoulder, gentle, firm, until the wall was between her and the door. He put himself at the hinge side. He looked back at her once. Whatever was in that look, it wasn't fear. It was a man checking that the thing he loved was behind cover. Don't open it, he said, low. Let them talk to the wood. The voice through the door was smooth, accented, reading off a page. Ms. Whitfield, we have documents regarding the property. Court ordered. You need to open the door and accept service, or we proceed without you. A pause, paper shifting. This is your last window to cooperate, ma'am. Leona pressed her back to the wall and looked at Tae-song across the dark. He shook his head, 1 inch each way. There's no one here but me, she called, and her voice came out even, hospital even, the voice she used on a man holding his own severed thumb. Slide it under the door. I'm not opening at 11 at night for a stranger with a clipboard, murmuring outside. More than one voice now. She counted the murmurs the way she counted breaths on a monitor. 3, 4, a shoe scraping the far end of the porch, a shape crossing the front window, then another. Not 4, more. Ma'am, we can't slide a lien execution under a door. Open up. We don't want trouble. That last part, we don't want trouble. That was the tell. Amara quiet in her chest, Leona thought. Honey, men who don't want trouble don't bring 7 friends. Then the knob turned. It turned slow, testing, and the deadbolt held, and something in the wood creaked as a shoulder leaned into it. Not a slam, a lean, a test of how much house stood between them and a signature. Tae-song's hand came up flat again. Wait, wait. And then everything happened at the speed of a dropped glass. He reached past her, unlocked the deadbolt himself, and pulled the door open. Not to let them in, to end the guessing, to put light on faces and faces on his own math. The porch bulb hit the doorway and threw a hard yellow wedge across the men bunched at the top of the steps, and there were a lot of them. Dark coats, empty hands held out with folded paper like it was a shield, the front 2 already leaning in with the confidence of men expecting 1 woman and 1 lock. The front man's mouth opened to say the next line off his script. He never said it. Because the man just behind his left shoulder, narrow, jittery, hood pushed back off a shaved head, a small mole under one restless eye, that man looked past the woman in the doorway to the tall shape standing at the hinge, and the porch light caught the side of a neck and caught black ink climbing up out of a collar, a tail curling toward an ear. Che Mu-jin made a sound that wasn't a word. It came out of him like a hiccup, high and strangled, and his hand shot out and grabbed the front man's coat from behind and yanked. Ya, chamkan, mulloso, back, wait. His whole body went the wrong direction, hauling backward against the pack that was still pushing forward, a man swimming upstream through his own crew. The front man stumbled, twisted, snarled something at Mu-jin. What are you doing? And Mu-jin couldn't answer. That was the thing Leona would remember. His mouth worked, and nothing came out that the others could use, because what he had to say was the one thing he could not say in front of 7 men and a mark. That's him. That's the boss. That's the quiet one. We are 8 men, standing on the wrong porch. He couldn't say it, so he just pulled, and his face came apart. Taesong stepped into the doorway. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He simply moved into the light, so all of them could see what one of them had already seen. And the change that went through the pack was a live thing, a wave, the front rank feeling the back rank falter before they understood why. Then the sides of the yard came alive. They came out of the dark the way he'd promised the dark would hold, not from black cars, not in a line, but from the hedge 2 houses down, from the bed of the strange truck, from a parked sedan with grocery bags in the back window, from the shadow of a porch where a man had been fixing a light for 2 nights. Ryu Sukjin's men. 6, 7, more, closing from 3 sides at a dead run and dead silent, and not one of them drew a thing. No metal. He'd meant it. What happened on that lawn happened with hands. It was fast, and it was ugly, and it was quiet, which was the strangest part. No gunshots, no shouting, just the heavy wet sounds of bodies going down onto wet grass, a knee driven into the back of a coat, an arm folded up behind a spine, until the man attached to it stopped being a problem. One of Do-hyun's men swung a folded stack of court paper like it might help. It fluttered across the yard. A big shape in a gray coat took him around the waist and put him into the flower bed Marcus had built 4 springs ago, and the man stayed there, cheek in the mulch, breathing. Leona pressed her back to the doorframe and watched her front lawn turn into something she had no name for. Her hand found the cross. She didn't scream. Screaming was for people who thought noise bought them something, and she'd learned in a dark imaging hall what noise cost. Seokjin came up the walk last, black gloves, collar high, an earpiece catching the porch light, walking through the wreckage of 8 men, like a foreman through a job half done. He took the front man off his feet with an efficiency that was almost boredom, cuffed the wrists behind with a plastic strap, and left him kneeling in the grass. 7 of them went down. 7 were pressed into the lawn, into the flower bed, against the side of the truck, wrists bound, faces turned, done. The 8th didn't fight. Chae Moo-jin had backed all the way off the steps and stood at the edge of the light with his empty hands up near his shoulders, not surrendering to Seokjin's men, surrendering to Taesong. His eyes were wet and huge and fixed on the man in the doorway, and his mouth was still moving, a whisper now, the same 2 syllables over and over. He didn't run. He didn't swing. When one of the gray coats reached for him, he just lowered himself to his knees on the wet grass on his own, hands up, staring, and let himself be bound, because he was the only man on that lawn who had understood, 1 full second before everyone else, exactly whose porch light he was standing in. Then it was over. It had taken maybe 90 seconds. The lawn was full of bound men and quiet men, and the small, awful sounds of people breathing through pain, and the strange truck's engine ticked as it cooled, and somewhere down the block a dog finally started barking at a thing already finished. Taesong turned in the doorway. He looked at her first, before the lawn, before Seokjin, before any of it. He turned and found her face and read it, and whatever he'd been braced to see there, he saw worse. "You're not hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. He needed it to be true out loud. Leona looked past him, at the men on her grass, at the flower bed, at the folded court papers scattered white across the dark lawn like something molted, at the kneeling man at the edge of the light who was still, whispering at the tattoo on the neck of the man she'd let sleep in her house tonight. At Seokjin's gloved hand resting easy on the shoulder of a bound stranger, a man who'd clearly done this exact thing many times, on many lawns, for this exact quiet man in her doorway. She'd known. She'd made her list. She'd said the words out loud in this kitchen. "He's not a courier." She'd known for days, in the cold reasoning part of her that read fake paperwork in a single glance. But knowing a thing and watching 8 men fold onto your dead husband's flower bed at the raise of one man's chin are not the same knowing. One lives in your head. The other stands in your doorway and calls you by the way you hold a door. Her hand was steady on the cross. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It never was. "How many people," she said, "does it take to make a night this quiet?" He didn't answer that one. He couldn't. There wasn't an answer that made her yard smaller. Sok-jin's voice came up from the lawn, clipped, in English for her benefit or in spite of it. 7 secured. Ones. He glanced at the kneeling man, the wet face, the whispering. "One's not a problem. Never was. He knew you." He said the last part to Taesong, and there was a question buried in it, and Leona caught the question even if she couldn't read the man. Taesong looked at Chae-mu-jin then, really looked. And something crossed his face, recognition running the other direction now, the boss placing the crewman, understanding in one beat that of all 8 men Do-hyun had sent to a widow's door, one had once stood close enough to the quiet one to know the fish on his neck by porch light, the one who'd saved them all a bloodbath, the one who'd tried, choking on it, to pull 7 men off a cliff he could see, and they couldn't. "Leave that one to me," Taesong said, low. And Leona heard it. "Leave that one to me," said the way a man says a thing he's said 1,000 times, to men who move when he says it. The whole architecture of him rearranged in front of her in that one flat sentence. Not the careful courier who listened to her hospital stories in the dead hour after her shifts. Not the man who let her hold every door. A man who said, "Leave that one to me," and watched it become true. She stepped back from the doorway. One step, bare feet on cold floor. Not away from the lawn, away from him. He caught it. Of course he caught it. He caught everything. That was the whole terrible gift of him. He turned fully from the yard, from Sok-jin, from the kneeling man, and gave her his whole face in the low kitchen light, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was something in it that looked almost like fear. Not of the 8 men, not of Do-hyun, not of any medal or any court. Fear of the woman in the Henley, taking one step back on her own floor. "Leona," he said her name like it might hold the door open. "Let me get them off your street, then I'll tell you anything you ask, all of it. I won't leave a single—" "Stop." Quiet, flat. The hospital voice, the one that ended visiting hours and told families the truth. "Stop talking about what you'll do." The lawn breathed behind him. Somewhere a bound man groaned and went still. She looked at the man who'd walked the last block alone, so no car would announce him at her door. Who'd come with no gun because a gun near this house was a mistake he wouldn't make. Who had, tonight, saved her. There was no other word for it. Saved her. And who had also, she understood now with a cold that started at the cross and spread out, been the reason 8 men knew her address in the first place. The storm hadn't come to her house by accident. It had followed him to her door, and he'd known, and he'd built a wall of strangers around her grief without asking, and he'd let her pour every small confession into a phone while he stood in the dark of her street, deciding what she could carry. The question she'd asked on the phone an hour ago, the one he'd never answered, she asked it again, standing in her own doorway, with his men on her lawn and his name on a frightened crewman's lips and the tail of a black fish riding up out of his collar in the light. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. It landed like a dropped scalpel on tile. "Who are you?" He gave her the truth, the way he gave her everything, with the exit left open, even now. "Jung Tae-song," he said. He let the name sit on the wet grass between them. "People who need me call me the quiet one." She heard it and did not flinch. That was the part that scared him. A woman who flinches is still deciding. Leona had already decided. "A boss," she said. "Yes." She said the word back to herself, testing its weight, turning it over the way she'd turned the residual balance letter until the crease went white. Boss. Not courier. Not logistics and hotels, I guess. The word she'd been afraid to reach for at Deborah's elbow in the break room, sitting now in her own front yard in a man's throat. Of what? He could have softened it. He picked the hard word instead, because she had earned the hard word. Logistics. Security. Hotels. Property. The kind of business that keeps its own men and settles its own debts. He looked at the 7 zip-tied on her lawn, at the 8th kneeling in the flower bed Marcus built. The kind of business that came to your door tonight. Leona followed his eyes to the men. To the papers scattered in the grass. To Sukjin standing over the front man with the bored patience of someone who had done this 100 times. And something moved behind her face. Not a break, a resorting. He watched her go back through every night they'd had and reread it with the new word in her hand. The phone calls after her shifts. The dinner with no sign on the door. The woman who greeted him by a name that wasn't his. The rooms in his life that never closed. The brother dead at 19 he wouldn't explain. Every gap she'd filed away, filling in at once. The hospital, she said slowly. The 3 men. The fake police. His. Taesung's jaw set. Bae Do-hyun. He's been trying to take my routes for 2 years. When he couldn't get me killed in a quiet room, he followed the nurse who wouldn't let him. He didn't look away from her. The lien on your house. The 81,000. The men tonight. All of it exists because of me. Because you turned off the lights for me. There it was. The whole shape of it. Laid down between them without a single soft edge. Leona wrapped her hand around the cross. Not to pray, to hold on to something that had been hers before him. You knew, she said, at the restaurant, on the drives, when I told you Marcus died on a Tuesday, you already knew somebody had put my house in the middle of your war. I knew this morning, he said, for certain. And you put men on my street. Yes. Without telling me. Yes. She nodded, the way she nodded when a chart confirmed the thing she'd feared before she ordered the test. You decided I was safer, not knowing. You were safer, not knowing. That wasn't yours to decide. The words didn't rise. They didn't have to. They went into him clean, the way the good blade goes in. No burn until later. Sukjin, 30 feet away, went still over the front man. Even he knew that one had landed somewhere it couldn't be pulled out of. Taesung took 1 step onto the grass. He stopped himself before the second. If I had told you, you'd have argued. You'd have wanted to handle it your way, with your lawyer and your locks and your list. And you would have opened that door tonight, because you're the kind of woman who answers when someone knocks. His voice dropped. I couldn't gamble your life on your pride, so you gambled it on yours. Leona looked at the flower bed, at Chae Moo-jin kneeling in it, wet-eyed, wrists bound, the only one of 8 who'd known whose porch he was standing on. That one recognized you. He did. That's why nobody's dead. Taesung's silence was the answer. She laughed once, low, no joy in it. Your tattoo saved my life twice. She said it like a diagnosis. The first time it made me save you. Tonight it made that boy scream, in a language I don't speak, so his friends wouldn't kick my door in. She pressed the heel of her hand to her sternum. And now the same mark just told me everything you are. He watched the woman he'd let himself want do the math out loud and arrive, every time, at him. I need you to leave, she said. Leona, take them. She gestured at the lawn, at the men, at all of it. Take your men and your ties and your boy who knows your fish. Get it off my street. Her voice never climbed. It stayed in the register she used to tell families the news they couldn't survive hearing loud. You can protect me from 8 men with papers. You can't protect me from the one thing that actually happened here, which is that a man I let in, decided he knew better than me what I could carry. Taesong stood in her yard with no weapon and no argument, and, for the first time in 11 years, no next move. I buried a husband who never once decided a single thing about my life without asking me first, Leona said. He was a good man who did small things. You are, whatever you are, and you did a big thing, in the dark, in my name. She stepped back to her own threshold, her own door. Go home, Taesong. The men on your street stay one more night. He said it, and then heard himself say it and stopped. Because it was the crime again, right there in his mouth. One more time. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the boss was gone from his face, and only the man was left. No, they don't. You decide who's on your street. I'll pull them tonight. Yes, she said, you will. He went. Not because she couldn't have stopped him, because he finally understood that staying would be the same crime, committed twice. Seokjin cut the front man loose from the zip tie, hauled him up by the collar, and moved down the line. Within 10 minutes, the lawn was empty of everything but the flattened grass, and the scattered papers, and the ruined edge of the flower bed. Moojin went last. At the mouth of the driveway, he looked back, not at his boss, at Leona, and dipped his head once, the small bow of a man who knew exactly what he'd almost done, and exactly who'd stopped him. Then the black cars that had never once parked in her street pulled away into it and were gone. Leona stood in her doorway until the taillights turned the corner. Then she went inside, slid the bolt, and pressed her back to the door in the dark. She did not cry. The ocean stayed behind its locked door, same as always. But for the first time in a year, her hands were shaking for a reason that wasn't cold. The next morning, she called Okafor before he'd finished his coffee. She did not tell him about the 8 men. She told him to freeze the lien harder, to pull every filing Meridian Crest Holdings had ever touched, and to send her, not anyone else, copies of all of it. In my name, she said, everything comes to me first. Miss Whitfield, Okafor said carefully, somebody moved fast for you overnight. There's a supplemental filing already logged. Forensic Document Examiner's affidavit. The notary stamp on your lien is a forgery, and there's paper here proving whose office generated it. A pause. Who's your friend downtown? I don't have a friend downtown, Leona said, and hung up. She was wrong, and she knew she was wrong, and she hated the exact shape of how wrong she was. Because across the city, Taesong was doing the one thing she'd told him she could not forgive, deciding, and doing it, this time, in a way she could refuse if she wanted to. He didn't send men to Bae-do-hyun. He sent accountants. He sent lawyers with real bar numbers and clean hands. He took the forged notary stamp and the shell company and the $81,000 fiction, and he peeled them apart in daylight, filing by filing, until the fraud that was supposed to bleed him into the open was sitting on a prosecutor's desk with Do-hyun's fingerprints all over the instrument. No bodies, no black cars, just paper, turned back on the man who'd forged it. It was slower than a knife. It cost more. For a man who had settled his own debts his whole life, it was the harder road by every measure, and he chose it deliberately, because the fast way was the way that had put the war on her lawn, and he was done being the reason her door got knocked on. Once, on the second night, a name came up through Seokjin, a man of Do-hyun's who'd been in the county lockup van at the hospital, the tall one, the one who'd read the fear on Leona's face and believed it. The old Taesong would have had an answer for that man. This one wrote the name on the affidavit instead, under oath, in ink, and let the courts have him. Every hand that had reached for her house, he turned into a signature on a page. Seokjin, watching him work through the third straight night, finally said what he'd been holding. You could have him gone in an hour, the old way. The old way is why she shut the door, Taesong said, and kept reading. There were 2 loose ends he closed himself, quietly, before the week was out. The first was a hospital badge on a lanyard, face down in a storm drain off a loading dock, the one she'd handed him the night she pulled him into the dark. He'd known where it was the whole time. He had it recovered and destroyed before any investigator thought to look, because her license was the one thing in this she'd risked without knowing she was risking it, and he wasn't going to let it be the price of saving him. The second was the boy. Chae Moo-jin had knelt in her flower bed with his hands up and screamed in Korean to keep his own crew off her door. Hulafle, Taesong didn't bury that. He kept him, off Do-hyun's dead payroll, onto his own, the one man of the 8 who'd chosen a stranger's porch over his orders. Leave that one to me, had meant this. A debt paid forward instead of settled in blood. By the end of the week, Meridian Crest Holdings existed only as an exhibit. The lien on Leona's house dissolved. Not settled, not paid, dissolved. Wiped from the county record as an instrument obtained by fraud. Bae Do-hyun kept his life and lost the roots, the contracts, the shell, the name he'd built to hide behind, and the freedom to move without a lawyer at his elbow. He'd wanted to bleed the quiet one into the light. Instead, he ended up in it alone. And Taesong took every clean copy of every document, the affidavit, the dissolution, the proof, put it in a plain envelope, and had it delivered to Leona's lawyer. In her name, for her to run, her way, with her attorney, at her speed, no note, no ask, no man on her street. The house was hers again, free and clear, the way the insurance had made it a year ago, before a stranger's war landed on it. She let 3 weeks pass before she called him. They met in a coffee shop she chose, in daylight she chose, at a corner table with 2 exits she'd counted before he arrived. She wore the camel coat over a white blouse, cross at her throat as always, and she got there first, because the woman who arrives first is the woman who decides when it starts. He came in without the men, without the car that announces him. He sat where she pointed. For a moment, neither of them touched their cups. A woman 2 tables over laughed at something on her phone. The espresso machine hissed. It was the most ordinary room they had ever been in together, and that was the point. She'd chosen daylight and strangers and a cheap ceramic mug on purpose, so that whatever this was would have to survive without the dark to hide in. You dissolved it, she said. Not settled. Dissolved. It was never real. I made the record say so. You sent it to me, in my name. It was always yours. He turned his coffee a quarter turn and left it. I decided one last thing for you, that you should be the one to decide everything after. Then I stopped. Leona studied him the way she studied a wound to see if it would hold. I have rules, she said. Tell me. No men on my street I didn't invite, ever. Not to protect me, not to watch me, not for my own good. She held up a second finger. Nothing about my house happens without me. Not a lock, not a lawyer, not a lien. Mine. A third. You never lie to me again and call it protection. If it's dangerous, you tell me it's dangerous, and you let me be the one who's scared. That's mine too, my fear. You don't get to carry it for me. He listened the way he'd always listened, like the thing under the words was the thing he was answering. Yes, he said, to all of it. Not the yes of a man managing her, the yes of a man setting something down. She watched him take each rule the way a man takes stitches, without pulling away from the needle. Deborah's voice was somewhere in the back of her head, the old warning from the break room. A man with money and no nameable job is a question. She had the answer now. The answer was worse than the question, and she was sitting across from it anyway, on her own terms, with the exits counted. There's one more, she said. Deborah told me a year ago to let somebody carry a piece of it. I didn't. Not for anybody. She turned her cup a quarter turn, the way she'd once watched him turn his. I'll let you carry a piece. Not all of it. A piece. And only what I hand you. You don't reach into the box and take. Only what you hand me, he repeated. I don't know what we are, she said. Neither do I. Good, she almost smiled. I've had enough of men who were sure. They started over from there. Slow, the way it had been slow the first time, but with the word out on the table now, the word that changed how she read every gentle thing he did. He never pushed a door. This time she knew it was because he'd finally learned he wasn't allowed to open it, not because he'd already decided he could. It was a month later, on a gray evening in her kitchen, that she did the thing she'd never done in front of anyone. She went to the closet. She pulled the plastic box with the blue lid out from behind the shoes, carried it to the table, and set it in front of him. 4 clicks. The lid came off. Marcus's mother made these, she said. She lifted the small knitted booties with the yellow ribbon, then the yellow blanket, bought in the joy of a first pregnancy that never warmed anyone. I lost the first at 10 weeks. The second was further, worse. Her thumb moved over the ribbon the way it moved over the cross. There was going to be a third. Then he died on a Tuesday, and I stopped opening this box, because if I opened it, I'd have to. And the door she'd lost the key to a year ago, the locked door with the ocean behind it, came open. She cried. In front of him, for the first time, not the composed nurse's silence, not the beat of holding it behind her teeth. She put the yellow blanket against her face and she wept, ugly and whole, the year of it, the 2 babies, and the husband, and the house she'd almost lost, all of it at once. He'd told her once, on a drive to nowhere, that she was the first person in a long time he'd wanted to tell anything. He'd told her about a brother, dead at 19, and left the how of it closed. She understood the box in front of her was her version of that closed door. The thing you don't open, because opening it means it was real. She was opening hers first. She was showing him how. Taesong did not reach for her. He did not fix it, or hush it, or decide what she needed. He stayed in his chair, across the table, and let her have it. He let her be the one holding the box. It was the hardest thing he had ever not done. Sit still while a woman he'd have burned a city for came apart 3 feet away, his hands flat on the table, letting her drown all the way, and trusting she'd come up on her own. When she finally set the blanket down, wrung out and clear-eyed, he said only one thing. Thank you for showing me. The same 2 words he'd brought to her street a lifetime ago, standing by his car in the dark. Only now, she understood what they cost a man who'd stopped telling anyone anything at 19. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and laughed, wet and surprised at herself. First time, she said, in a year. I know. You didn't try to stop it. No. That's why I let you see it. Almost a year later, a real year, seasons all the way around, there was a room in the small house being painted. Not the closet, a different room, the one at the end of the hall that had held boxes and now held drop cloths and a half-rolled wall of soft yellow. Leona stood in the doorway with a brush in her hand, cross at her throat, and said the thing she'd only ever prayed for without naming. I still want a daughter, she said. I've wanted her the whole time. I stopped being able to say it out loud. Taesong set down the roller. He crossed the drop cloths and stopped an arm's length from her. Always the arm's length, always the room to say no. If that future has space in it for me, he said, I want to build it with you. He held her eyes. With you, not for you, not around you while you sleep, not one decision of it behind your back. The corner of his mouth moved, the closest he came to a smile. You'll have to let me be scared with you. That's your rule. She looked at him a long moment, the boss with no men in the room, the quiet one in a paint-stained shirt, the man who had finally learned the difference between guarding something and owning it. "Come here," she said, and this time, she was the one who closed the distance. Later, when the wall was done and the yellow was drying, and they sat on the floor of the room with their backs against the fresh paint, he said, "Quiet. You know I could have kept you safe the whole time. My way. You never would have felt a thing. I know. You'd have hated it. I know that too." Leona turned the cross once between her fingers, then let it go. She looked at the yellow wall, at the door with no lock on it, at the man who had waited a year to be allowed inside his own life with her. "You didn't save me," she said. "You just finally stopped deciding for me." If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Tell me, K-Fam, have you ever saved someone with your own hands, only to learn they'd been deciding your life behind your back? When the man who loved you called it protection, would you have called it a lie? Mark my words, K-Fam. The hardest truth is choosing yourself. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about truth, protection, and self-worth, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.